Skeptics Review the Bible by John Smith.
Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the universe. Now, I own 3 Bibles, the King James, the Good News, and the NIV, and they use slightly different words to describe things. Occasionally, I'll try to compare them. Notice the terms heaven and the earth versus universe. I find that particularly interesting in the sense that the Good News chooses the word universe. I can only suspect that they're trying to modernize the Bible to fit our current knowledge of science. Also notice the terms empty, void, and desolate. Perhaps you're thinking I'm getting a little nitpicky here. If so, then could you please explain to me surface of the deep, face of the deep, and raging ocean? Those seem like really different things. So next, God creates light, and he created it before creating a light source somehow. Next, he makes a dome and he calls it sky. Now, my NIV version calls it an expanse. An online version of the NIV refers to it as a vault. King James calls it a firmament. Good News calls it a dome. So, I don't know, you decide. Then he makes land, calls it earth, collects all the water together, calls it sea. Genesis 1 only covers the first 6 days, and I don't want to get too far ahead. Genesis 2 doesn't really match. Lots of other videos go into this in great detail. So then God makes 2 larger lights, the sun to rule the day and the moon to rule the night. The moon is a light source? Okay. Next, God creates creatures that live in the air and the sea. So he makes great sea monsters, apparently, and other sea creatures, like mantis shrimp. Then he makes all kinds of birds, like kiwis, and bats. Bear with me, later on in the Bible, bats are birds. Next, he makes all kinds of animals, wild and domestic, like honey badgers. Finally, he gets around to making human beings, and he says, they will resemble us. They will be like us and resemble us. So my first question is, who's us? Christians will say it's the Trinity. Jews maybe not so much. I don't know, you tell me, who's us? So anyway, then he creates them, male and female. So it states here pretty clearly that on day 6, God creates male and female. Later on, it goes off to say that he created woman from man's rib. And I could go off on a whole Lilith tangent. So then God tells man what he can eat and says, hey, I made plants for man and animals to eat. And so far, there are no restrictions whatsoever on anything in the garden. At the start of Genesis 2, God is done creating the entire universe, apparently. As I stated in the last video, the Good News Bible uses the term universe, as opposed to heaven and earth. So there are no plants or seeds for some reason, even though God created plants back on day 3 in Genesis 1, and there's no rain to cultivate the garden. So all that stuff you learned about the water cycle in science class, yeah, that's not a thing yet. Then God made a man out of soil, or dust, depending on your translation. And man became a living being, or soul, or began to live. Again, back in Genesis 1, God created both man and woman on the 6th day, so now God is creating man again, but not woman. Next, God makes the Garden of Eden and sticks 2 special trees in it. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, or according to Good News, it's simply good and bad, and the tree of life. And then we go off on what I consider a kind of weird side note where we talk about local rivers. And I get it that the narrator's trying to tell us the approximate location of Eden, and the Tigris and the Euphrates are helpful, but the Gihon and the Pishon are not. For some reason, the narrator thought it was relevant to insert a bit about gold and precious stones being found at one of those rivers. Since this is the beginning of humanity, essentially, and there's only one man alive thus far, and he's walking around naked and has very little knowledge of anything, I don't really think he cares about precious stones at this point, and I don't see how it's relevant to the story, except maybe as a reference to readers much later who go, oh yeah, that river. So, on a 30-second Google search for these rivers, Gihon and Pishon, quickly revealed that I would have to do a way more in-depth Google search to really understand what the Gihon and the Pishon are referring to, as many sites seem to think that many different rivers are the Gihon and the Pishon. Some of them say that one of these rivers is all the way in Ethiopia. Another one says the Red Sea itself was one of those rivers. Creationist apologists will tell you something like Pangea existed 6,000-ish years ago and it was pre-flood, and that's supposed to conveniently explain all of your hard questions as to where these rivers are and why some of them are now in Africa or giant seas. So God put the as yet unnamed man in the garden to cultivate it and guard it. I don't know why it needs cultivating, I don't know why it needs guarding, or how a naked, nameless man is going to guard it, but there you go. Finally, we get the prohibition on eating from the tree of good and evil. Notice there's no prohibition on the tree of life at this point. Also notice, very important, in the Good News translation it says, if you eat from the tree of knowledge, you will die that day. Very important to note for later. Then God decides to make a companion to help the unnamed man, because all that cultivating and guarding, I guess, is a pretty big job. I guess also the first woman God created in Genesis must have run off by now or something. So God creates animals again. The man, who has no name yet himself, spends a busy day naming countless animals. The nameless man couldn't find a suitable companion amongst the animals to help him, and I shudder to think what the test is for suitable companion. If you think I'm being crass with my humor here, you should probably pick up a book called Hebrew Myths by Robert Graves and Raphael Patai, and go to the chapter called Adam's Helpmeets. You know what, on second thought, maybe you shouldn't. So God makes the unnamed man go to sleep, he takes out one of the man's ribs, makes a yet unnamed woman. Then we get a curious verse about becoming one flesh, that defenders of traditional marriage will say is one of the verses that proves God only ever intended one husband and one wife. You know, Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, or Adam and Eve and Jennifer and Julie and Becky and Allison, or Adam and Eve's slave girl, or Adam and Eve and the virgins Adam took for himself as captured spoils of war, you know. Anyway, a few chapters later, a guy named Lamech gets 2 wives. Never mind, try not to think about it too much. So, in conclusion, the man and the woman were naked and not embarrassed about it. And that ends chapter 2 of Genesis. So the snake was the craftiest creature in the garden, or subtle, or cunning. You pick, depending on your version of the Bible. Now I want to point out that in many popular pieces of art about the serpent in the garden, the snake is frequently portrayed anthropomorphically with arms and legs and a human head, often as a woman. Now, nowhere in Genesis does it say the snake is this. The snake is not Satan. I know, later in the New Testament it tries to retcon the serpent to be Satan, but I'm pretty sure the Jews who own the book first would disagree with you. If you don't believe me, then I recommend a book called The Birth of Satan that I recently read, that was featured in a video by 43 Alley, whose channel I totally recommend. Anyway, the crafty, subtle, cunning snake has a conversation with the unnamed woman about things that can and cannot be eaten in the garden, and the woman informs the snake that the tree of knowledge is off limits. Notice she doesn't mention the tree that gives life. The woman says she can't even touch the fruit of the tree of knowledge or she'll die. Remember, in the Good News Bible, we were warned that you will die that day. The snake then says, "That's not true. You won't die. God knows you'll gain knowledge if you eat from that tree." So, I don't know about you, but I see that as God purposefully misleading his human creatures. So the woman eats the fruit and gives some to her husband, who has no objections apparently. What exactly is this knowledge that they gain from eating this fruit? Well, they realize they're naked, and they learn how to sew leaves together to cover themselves, apparently. So yeah, totally worth it. Then we have God walking in his garden, and he can't find his newly created unnamed humans. So the omnipotent, omnipresent God calls out, "Where are you?" The humans then tell God they're naked, and omnipotent, omnipresent God asks, "Who told you that you're naked? And did you eat the fruit I told you not to eat?" Surely, an omnipotent, omnipresent God would already know the answers to these questions. Next, we play the blame game, where the man blames the woman blames the snake. It's like the first two kids ever to get in trouble with their parents for playing ball in the house and something gets broken. Next, the omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent God gets all Old Testament on everyone. He curses the snake. He says, "You're going to crawl on the ground and eat dust." Then he tells the woman that childbearing is going to be much more painful and that women will be subject to their husbands. So yeah, ladies, it's right there in the Bible. Go make me a sandwich. Next, God tells the man he's going to have to work really hard to get his food, and there's going to be weeds and thistles. And when man dies, he's going to return to the soil from whence he came. That's pretty harsh. And then all of a sudden, our unnamed humans inexplicably get names for the first time. So Adam and Eve, and then Eve is Adam's wife. And then God gives them clothes out of animal skins. And finally, an omnipotent, omnipresent God is worried that if the humans eat from the tree of life, they will be like us. So we're back to that whole us quandary. Then God puts living creatures and a flaming sword to guard the tree of life. Other book says cherubim, but whatever. So as we pick up Genesis chapter 4, we learn that Adam has sexy time with Eve, and they have some kids named Cain and Abel. In the King James, they often use the phrase, "so-and-so knew his wife." But in the NIV and the Good News, they're a little more direct with "make love" and "have intercourse with." I just love it when I hear Christians saying that kids are learning sex ed too early in school, and Christians categorize pictures like this as porn. And then they hand their kids this book. Isn't that ironic? So Cain was a farmer and Abel was a shepherd. Both of them made offerings to God, but God likes barbecue meat, not barbecue veggies. Cain wasn't very happy that God didn't like his sacrifice, but God informs Cain that if he'd done the right thing, he would be smiling. By burning veggies instead of meat, Cain had done some sort of evil. Basically, God tells Cain, "Hey, don't be mad, bro." Next, Cain lures his brother out in the field and kills him. Yeesh. Again, Christians who complain too much about violence on TV or in video games, they'll want to hand their kids this book instead. Good thing most kids don't bother to read it. Next, omnipresent, omnipotent God asks Cain, "Where's your brother?" And Cain responds, "It's not my turn to watch him." The King James and the NIV are consistent on this when they say, "Am I my brother's keeper?" But this time, omnipotent, omnipresent God knows what happened and curses Cain. God tells Cain that he can't grow plants in his vegetable garden anymore. Cain responds that the punishment is more than he can bear, and if anyone finds him, they will kill him? So far, we've only met 4 humans, and he just killed one. Who's going to find him? His parents? Anyway, God puts a mark on Cain so no one will kill him, and Cain goes to live in a land called Wandering, according to the Good News Bible. It's called Nod everywhere else. I know, Nod means wandering. This is where my Sunday school lesson on Cain and Abel normally ends. As an aside, I recommend the book Ishmael, which does an excellent commentary on the Cain and Abel story, and says basically the Cain and Abel story is an allegory for nomadic societies and agricultural societies and land disputes between them. As long as you suspend your disbelief that a talking gorilla is telling humans the history of man, it's a great book. Anyway, speaking of suspension of disbelief, continuing on with our Bible story. Cain makes sexy time with his wife. Where did Cain get a wife? Yeah, Christians, I know. So maybe the Bible doesn't name all of Adam and Eve's kids. But that still means Cain married his sister, and got her pregnant. Then she had a kid named Enoch. Next, Cain builds a city? What? And he names that city Enoch, so... City? Really? Anyway, next we get Cain's family tree. Only the males, of course, at least mostly, until we get to our old friend Lamech, who has 2 wives. Then we learn Lamech follows in Cain's tradition and kills a guy. Lamech strangely declares that he gets 70 times more curse than Cain's mere 7 times. Finally, Adam and Eve have another son and name him Seth. No, not that Seth. That Seth. So Genesis 5 is one of those chapters which contains a long-winded genealogy. Now, I don't want to skip any chapters, so I was really racking my brain on how to make this video interesting. Before I get to that though, I want to bring up something that's really annoyed me. Maybe you've noticed it too. So let me read a few verses and you'll see what I mean. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them, and he named them mankind when they were created. And here's another one. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. There's probably some reason it's written this way, linguistically, orally, something to do with the original Hebrew. But seriously, trying to sludge through that in English, I wanted to scream at the Bible and say, "You just said that a sentence ago." Anyway, I decided to see if we can't make this chapter fun somehow and play some games. So in this first game, let's compare the family line of Cain from the previous chapter to the line of Seth in this chapter. I put them side by side. Okay, so Enoch and Enosh. Pretty similar. Hey look, Enoch and Enoch. Perfect match. Gold star. Mahujadel and Mahalalel. That's pretty close. Methushael and Methuselah. Yeah. Look, Lamech and Lamech. Another gold star. Awesome. So why these similarities in the names in these 2 genealogies? I can only suspect that Cain and Seth's families kept trading the same baby naming book back and forth for hundreds of years. That's pure speculation on my part. Okay, so let's try another game. Let's ask a series of questions. So first question. Who lived to be 969 years old? Seth, Methuselah, or Noah? If you said Methuselah, as portrayed here by Rip Van Winkle, you're correct. Gold star. Next question. Who spent his life in fellowship with God, and then God took him away? Lamech, as portrayed by a painting of the other Lamech, Mahalalel, as portrayed by Gandalf, or Enoch? If you said Enoch, correct! Gold star! Final question. Whose name sounds like the Hebrew for relief. Noah, Enoch, or Enosh, as portrayed by Dumbledore. This is a hard one, as I found this in the footnotes of my Bible. Here's a hint. He has 3 sons named Shem, Ham, and Japheth. If you said Noah, correct! Gold star! Well, I hope you enjoyed my Bible genealogy game. Thanks for playing. See you next time. So we've got a little bit of information here to unpack here in Genesis chapter 6. We'll start with heavenly beings having sexy time with beautiful mortal women. Humans are beginning to multiply like rabbits and spread all over the place. So some heavenly beings saw that human women were beautiful. The Good News Bible calls them heavenly beings. The King James and the NIV use the phrase sons of God. That phrase is actually more common than Christians would probably be comfortable with admitting, but that's a video for another day. I learned that there are different ideas as to who or what these heavenly beings are. Some people say angels, but others say angels lack the proper equipment. Some will say Nephilim. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I always thought Nephilim were a cross between angel and human, so wouldn't that sort of contradict the whole angels don't have the proper equipment? Finally, sons of God is supposed to mean earthly kings. So then God decides that from now on, humans can't live any longer than 120 years. So keep that number in your head because we'll come back to it later. Then the Bible says, there were giants in those days. You know, giants. And mighty men and famous heroes. That all sounds pretty cool. But even though there were giants and heroes and mighty men and it was cool, they still did a lot of evil. God is sorry he made humans and is filled with regret and is deeply troubled, and he grieveth and repenteth that he made them. Those are an awful lot of emotions for an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God, wouldn't you say? Especially since all the way back in Genesis 1, every time God created something, he said it was good. God decided he was going to wipe out all the humans, animals, and birds. And who can blame him? I mean, just look at them. Ugh. Get rid of them. Drowned them already. Sheesh. So Noah was the goodiest goody-goody there was at the moment. Spoiler alert. He becomes an ornery drunk after this flood fiasco, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. I would like to point out that in our last chapter on genealogies, Noah's dad Lamech had other children. So Noah does have siblings. Some combination of brothers and sisters we never hear about and obviously don't survive the flood. Remember, Noah ends up only taking himself, his wife, and his 3 kids and their wives. Just thought I should point that out. Next, God gives Noah instructions on how to build the ark with gopher wood, cypress wood, or just plain old good timber. The King James and the NIV give measurements in cubits. The Good News Bible is helpful for us poor Americans who can't even use or figure out the metric system and list everything in feet for us. None of that really means anything until you can actually put the ark into scale, and there are plenty of informative images around the internet to help you out with that. Okay, so I know that you have a lot of questions about the flood, and I'm going to address them here. Remember, in the last chapter, God regretted making all of the living things and wanted to drown all the humans and animals and birds, except for Noah, who he said was a big goody-goody who post-flood becomes an ornery drunk, but never mind that now. God tells Noah to get 7 pairs of clean animals and only 2 pairs of unclean animals. And here's where we see the term kind that so many skeptics seem to have a problem with. Can't imagine why. Anyway, Noah gets 7 pair of this kind of animal, but only 2 of this kind of animal. Now you can go to any number of apologist websites and research what animals are clean and unclean. Something about chewing the cud or eating carrion or bottom feeding fish, something like that. Go look it up for yourself. I'm not doing all the work for you. Yeah, I know what you're going to say. How did God or Noah get all those animals on the ark? Like polar bears, alligators, penguins, honey badgers, bison, South American tree frogs, Indian elephants, kangaroo, and cute little koala bears. How did he get all of those to somewhere in the Middle East? Well, I already covered this in a previous video that the earth didn't look like that pre-flood. It looked like this. Weren't you paying attention? So after Noah gets all the animals, God opens the floodgates of the firmament, or dome, where all that water is, above the sun, the moon, the stars. And remember, there hasn't been any rain on the earth at all yet, because all the water has been sitting up there, or it's been seeping out of the ground. Duh! So for 40 days and 40 nights, it rained so hard that the water became deep and it covered the highest mountain by 25 feet. And you know that's true because there's limestone on the top of Mount Everest. I mean, come on. That just proves it. Don't try to change my mind with all that sciencey crap like ice core samples or the geologic record. Carbon dating's total bullcrap. You can read that on any number of apologist websites. Anyway, I talked about this in my very first video about Who, What, When, Where book about the Bible. You just need to have faith. Some doubt is good and healthy and even helpful, but too much doubt is harmful and it'll get you no place. The flood happened. It's historical fact. Get over it already. Jeez, I swear. There's just no talking to you guys sometimes. So last chapter we left off where omnibenevolent God had drowned every living thing on earth except for Noah, his family, and his boatload of 7 pair or 1 pair of each kind of animal. And it's a good thing omnipresent, omnipotent God didn't accidentally forget Noah and his boat. Then God made a wind to pass on the earth to get rid of all that water he dumped out from above the firmament dome. So yeah, here's God, here's Noah, and here's the wind. Seems legit. Next, Noah opened a window and a waft of stinky animal feces came out. Must have been the first breath of fresh air they had in a while. Noah sent out a raven, which kept flying around until all the water went down, which must have been hard work, since the raven was stuck in an ark for all that time and all its muscles had probably atrophied. You try sitting on the couch for 40 days and then getting up and doing a triathlon. See how you feel. Next, God let out a dove 3 times, or 3 separate doves. I can't remember. Anyway, 3rd time the dove came back with an olive branch. Immediately after getting off the ark, the first thing Noah does is sacrifice some of the clean animals. Now you may be asking here the wisdom of that choice, since number 1, all of the animals on earth that are left are the ones Noah brought with him, and number 2, that leaves less animals now than the meat-eating humans and predators get to eat for the rest of their lives. But you're forgetting that back in Genesis 1, God gave every green plant for food for every beast of the earth and bird in the sky. So they'll be alright, no worries. Stop asking silly questions. I've also had some people bring up the fact that the Noah's Ark story closely resembles the Gilgamesh flood story in a lot of ways. Well, you can just shut your pie hole on that. Go ahead and look at any apologist websites for yourself about the subject for the answer on that one. Clearly, the Gilgamesh story is only a myth, and the Bible is totally true. Everyone knows that. If you seriously believe that Noah's Ark came from Gilgamesh story, then you're just stupid and wrong. And you're a nasty L word, because ad hominem attacks clearly win every argument ever, so shut up about it already. In Genesis 9, God blessed Noah and his sons and told them to get busy having kids. Then he told them that animals would now be afraid of them. and that they were the masters of all animals, that God had delivered all of the animals into human hands. So remember that the next time some animal has the audacity to try to chase you or maul you or eat you, very firmly remind them that you are their master and read them this verse. Next, God says people can eat meat now, but he says no blood in the meat. Ew, we'd want to do that anyway. Ugh, just the thought of it makes me want to be a vegetarian. Bacon. Then God breaks off on a tangent about murder and basically says if one man kills another man, then that first man will be killed by a third man. God quickly gets back on track and tells Noah and his sons to get busy having kids. Wait a minute, didn't he already say that in verse 1? Well, I guess God wouldn't repeat himself unless he was serious. Go get to the baby making. Next, the King James says that God left his bow in the cloud. The NIV and the Good News say rainbow. And that's God's promise that he won't ever flood the earth again. Now, faultless goody-goody 600-plus-year-old Noah just went through a traumatic and very stressful ordeal, what with the whole collecting and keeping alive all those animals on a crappy wooden boat during a worldwide flood fiasco, so he needed a little me time for himself. He planted a vineyard, made some wine, started pouring, and vowed not to see the bottom of his glass. Inevitably, all that hardcore drinking led Noah to be passed out drunk and naked in his tent, of course. Noah's son Ham saw his dad lying there naked and stinking like a distillery, and instead of doing something truly awful like drawing on his dad's face with magic marker, Ham goes off to tell his brothers that dear old dad is in his cups again. Shem and Japheth go into the tent backwards and cover their dad with a cloak, portrayed here in this Michelangelo painting from the Sistine Chapel by all these completely naked dudes attempting to cover up another naked dude with what looks like a piece of material that's not going to cover up much of anything. That's right, I just made fun of a Michelangelo painting. I went there. What are you going to do about it? When Noah finally woke up, he cursed Ham and said Ham's son Canaan would be a slave to his brothers, and he would be the slave of Shem and the slave of Japheth, however you pronounce it. Yep, you heard that right. All of Ham's kids from now on are slaves because of what Ham did, or didn't do, something like that. While I was looking for pictures of Noah cursing Canaan on the internet, I came across this book, Noah's Curse, The Biblical Justification for American Slavery, $13.99 Kindle book on Amazon. I think I'm totally picking that one up. In conclusion, Noah lives to be 950 years old before his liver finally gives out. Genesis chapter 10 is another one of those long lists of so-and-so begat so-and-so. And again, I don't want to skip any chapters, but this one took a great deal of thought and some extra biblical research to try to figure out. We start with Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, or Japheth as it's sometimes pronounced. The offspring of these three brothers is called the Table of Nations, as the names that appear here are supposed to represent various tribes and countries of peoples, as well as why and where they eventually settled. There's a ton of charts on the internet, some more helpful than others, that put these names in some sort of visual context. There's also a plethora of maps that show where the families of these three brothers all went to, which are conveniently color-coded for us visual learners. I find all those things very helpful. Our first family line that this chapter covers is Japheth's line. Now my three Bibles all have slightly different names for some on this list. Rhodes, Cyprus, Spain versus Dodanim, Kittim, and Tarshish, stuff like that. But the thing that stuck out for me in these passages was the line, "Each group speaks its own language." We haven't yet read about the Tower of Babel, and this chapter doesn't give us any helpful numbers and years, like Cain and Seth's lines did a few chapters ago when everybody lived 800, 900 years. So I find this curious. They mention this here, that people had multiple languages. Anyway, we move on to Ham's line next. Now remember, Noah cursed Canaan, Ham's son, and his entire line in the previous chapter because Ham saw his dad naked. Some extra biblical research reveals Ham might have done slightly more than that, and I'll put links in the description below. But anyway, Wikipedia has a bit about Canaan not going to the land he was supposed to and settled in lands promised to others. This led to Canaan being cursed a second time. Apparently, this is in the book of Jubilees. On a personal note, I always wondered why God was later promising land to his chosen people where people already lived. This could be a possible explanation for that. Then we get a curious bit about Nimrod being a great warrior or hunter, and some extra research says that it was Nimrod who built the Tower of Babel. This passage in the Bible wants to go list all of his lands and cities. Next we get a mention of Egypt and the Philistines, who become future enemies of the Israelites. Also the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, etc. They all get future mentions as adversaries of Israel. Finally, we get Shem's line. An interesting bit on Wikipedia about Shem is that Shem apparently was born without a foreskin. And I've always wondered, what's God's obsession with foreskins and their subsequent removal? It seems like a bizarre thing to ask men to cut off, something that God gave them in such a highly sensitive area. This could be a possible explanation for that. It's the first explanation I've ever heard, so that's something anyway. Next, we get a bit about when the earth was divided during the life of a guy named Peleg. The word divided, of course, has many different websites divided on what they mean here. Was the world physically divided into the shape of the continents as we know them today? Or does it merely refer to the tribes or nations of people further dividing at this time? I don't know, you decide. The last important detail that we really need to glean from the Table of Nations is that the line goes from Noah and Shem all the way to Abraham. So there you go. Hope it wasn't too boring for you. Genesis chapter 11. So even though in the last chapter all the tribes in the Table of Nations had their own speech, chapter 11 starts out telling us that all of the people in the world have common speech and use the same words. These people all decided to pack up and move one day and ended up in Shinar, or Babylonia. Then they decided to build the Tower of Babel and make bricks with tar, or slime, or tar. They did this so they could make a name for themselves and not be scattered. Sounds good to me. Exactly how tall was this Tower of Babel? There are conflicting accounts, of course. Some say it was ziggurat-sized. The Book of Jubilees says different. And wow, I can see why God had to come down and check that out. God said, damn, if they can do that, soon enough they'll be launching stuff into space above my firmament dome, and the waters above the firmament dome. And we, as in the plural God we, can't have that. So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them all over the face of the whole earth. Yeah, Bible, you just said that. Next, we get, another begetting list? Wait, this is the same one as last chapter. Oh, man. Bad Bible. Bad Bible. Okay, so there are some differences between the last list and this one. This list reads like, When so-and-so had lived this many years, he became the father of what's-his-name. After he became the father of what's-his-name, so-and-so lived more years than God allowed back in Genesis 6:3. Then, so-and-so did some other stuff and died eventually. Rinse, repeat. Yeah, remember when God said man could no longer live more than 120 years? Apparently, he didn't really mean it yet. Though the numbers are steadily going down. Oh look, 119, gold star. Finally, we get to Abram, soon to be called Abraham. He has a wife named Sarai, later named Sarah. And she was barren, of course. It's a common theme in the Bible that whenever a couple can't have kids, it's always the woman's fault. Also, it bears mentioning that Sarah is Abraham's half-sister. Whoops, I should have said spoiler. Now the whole story is ruined, isn't it? You can't ever go back and watch the movie the same way again, can you? Sorry about that. God told Abram to get packing and go to a new land that God would show him. God also promised to make Abram famous and make his name great and a great nation. Abram thought that sounded pretty cool, so he packed up all his stuff, his wife and his nephew Lot, and all his slaves, and got moving to the land of Canaan. You remember Canaan, the son of Ham who got cursed because Ham saw his dad naked. Canaan, remember, went to a land he wasn't supposed to, though admittedly that last part of information is extra biblical. So should I ask my Christian friends why God promised land to his chosen people when there are already people living on that land and see what they say? What do you think? Yes? Next, Abram stopped at a sacred tree. Does God have sacred trees? No. Anyway, Abram made a sacrifice there, and God said, "This is the land I'm giving you." So Abram went on a sightseeing tour of his lands where other people were currently living that God promised would be his. You know, just trying to see where he was going to dig the pool and put the gazebo in, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, there was famine, so Abram had to cut his visit short and go to Egypt for a little while. On the way there, Abram tells his sister wife Sarai, "You are a beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they will kill me if they think you are my wife. Tell them you are my sister." Couple things here. Number one, is Abram lying? Well, not unless you consider it a lie by omission. Number two, just how beautiful was Sarai anyway? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to think of a woman named Sarah. Any woman named Sarah. I'm going to keep thinking about women named Sarah. Then I'm going to double the level of sexiness to the point where she's so irresistibly sexy, I would literally kill someone to get her. So you imagine that. Imagine you want someone, or something, so badly that you would kill other people and or yourself trying to get to her. Him. It. Whatever. Think of the Greek sirens in the Odyssey. Now, in my research, every picture and painting of Abram and Sarai or Abraham and Sarah that I've searched for shows them to be pretty similar in age, and Abram was about 70 when he started this journey, so I imagine Sarai has to be pretty close to that in age. I don't know, maybe there was pretty slim pickings on women in Egypt. Anyway, the Egyptians thought Sarai was gorgeous and told the king, and the king took Sarai and treated Abram well. And you know Sarai was totally a hot babe because the king gave Abram flocks of sheep and flocks of goats and flocks of cattle and flocks of donkeys and flocks of slaves and flocks of camels for her. Notice the slaves are mixed in the list with the sheep, goats, cattle, donkeys, and camels. Just wanted to point that out. Anyway, God didn't like what happened to Sarai, so he inflicted serious diseases and great plagues and terrible diseases on the king of Egypt, who is now called Pharaoh. Why? Pharaoh didn't know Sarai was Abram's sister wife. He just thought she was his totally sexy, hot 70-ish-year-old sister, which, remember, Abram didn't technically lie about. Then Pharaoh asked a valid question. Why did you say, "She is my sister"? I took her to wife, or might have taken her to wife, or you let me take her to wife. So I have to ask, is take a euphemism for something or not? You tell me. Sexy time? So Pharaoh told Abram to take his totally smoking hot sister wife and be on his way. Abram got to keep all the sheep, donkeys, goats, camels, and slaves apparently, which gave Abram ideas later because he used this ploy again. This chapter is pretty short, and I debated putting 2 chapters together, but the next chapter is long enough and has enough information to warrant its own video, so onward we go. Abram went out of Egypt to Negev, which was the southern part of Canaan, and I guess that after giving his 70-year-old hot-banging sister wife to Pharaoh for a while, and getting a bunch of herds and flocks and slaves and stuff for her, Abram had become something of a Bronze Age 1%er. Apparently, Lot was too. In fact, altogether they had so many herds and flocks and slaves that there wasn't enough grass for them all to eat. Lot's men and Abram's men ended up quarreling. The Bible is non-specific on what the quarreling entailed. Was it just mean words or was there violence? Doesn't say. Lot and Abram decided to separate. They were family after all, and you know how it is. You love your family, but the less time you spend around them, the better sometimes. So Lot went to a place called Zoar, which the Bible tells us is near Sodom, where people were wicked and sinned. Oh my God. Jeez. I guess these people didn't have internet porn back then, because they sure got creative. That image is burned in my brain. Seriously, folks, when I searched for Sodom, this picture came up. Don't blame me. Moving on, God tells Abram to look around, and God will give all Abram can see to his descendants forever and ever. Abram settled in Hebron, next to another sacred tree. Seriously, what's with all the sacred trees? It sounds pretty pagan to me. Then, Abram made a sacrifice. That's pretty much all that happens in this chapter. Like I said, pretty short. This chapter is pretty short, and I debated putting 2 chapters together, but the next chapter is long enough and has enough information to warrant its own video, so onward we go. Abram went out of Egypt to Negev, which was the southern part of Canaan, and I guess that after giving his 70-year-old hot-banging sister wife to Pharaoh for a while, and getting a bunch of herds and flocks and slaves and stuff for her, Abram had become something of a Bronze Age 1%er. Apparently, Lot was too. In fact, altogether they had so many herds and flocks and slaves that there wasn't enough grass for them all to eat. Lot's men and Abram's men ended up quarreling. The Bible is non-specific on what the quarreling entailed. Was it just mean words or was there violence? It doesn't say. Lot and Abram decided to separate. They were family after all, and you know how it is. You love your family, but the less time you spend around them, the better sometimes. So Lot went to a place called Zoar, which the Bible tells us is near Sodom, where people were wicked and sinned. Oh my God. Jeez. I guess these people didn't have internet porn back then, because they sure got creative. That image is burned in my brain. Seriously, folks, when I searched for Sodom, this picture came up. Don't blame me. Moving on, God tells Abram to look around, and God will give all Abram can see to his descendants forever and ever. Abram settled in Hebron, next to another sacred tree. Seriously, what's with all the sacred trees? Sounds pretty pagan to me. Then, Abram made a sacrifice. That's pretty much all that happens in this chapter. Like I said, pretty short. We begin this chapter with a war between 4 Mesopotamian kings and 5 kings from the Jordan Plains. They have some names that I will likely mispronounce, but I'll try. Bera, Bersha, Shinab, Shemaber, and the king of Bela, or Zoar, who I guess isn't important enough to get a name, versus Amraphel, Arioch, Kedorlaomer, or Chedorlaomer, and Tidal. There, I did my best. Of course, our 2 current Bible heroes find themselves embroiled in the coming conflict, naturally. Otherwise, why would we be reading about it? This epic battle of 9 kings and 2 armies, hey, that sounds very Lord of the Rings, takes place in Siddim Valley, or the Dead Sea, before it was the Dead Sea, I guess. Oh, and there were tar pits. Sweet. So these Mesopotamian kings squared up against the Siddim Valley kings, and battle ensued for a bit, and the Mesopotamian kings won, forcing the Siddim Valley army to retreat, some of which fell into the tar pits in their haste to run away. The Jordan Plains team wasn't doing very well on the scoreboard. The Mesopotamian kings sacked Sodom and Gomorrah, including Abram's nephew Lot, who happened to be living there, plus all Lot's stuff. And when Abram heard about it, he was none too happy. And you really don't want to see Abram when he's angry, because he got together 318 of his crack leg breakers and skull crackers and went after those mean old Mesopotamians. So 70-plus-year-old Abram, who looks pretty good for his age, and his 318 men chased those Mesopotamians as far as Haba, north of Damascus, and went all biblical on them. Abram recaptured all of the loot that had been taken, plus his nephew Lot, and all Lot's stuff, plus women and prisoners. Nice. I love how the Good News Bible calls it loot. Abram brought back all the loot to the people that the Mesopotamian kings had stolen it from, but first he gave some to some priest called Melchizedek, who was nice enough to bring Abram bread and wine. Seems fair. Next, the king of Sodom, I thought he fell in the tar pits, maybe they got a new one, told Abram to keep all the loot, but give back all the prisoners. Abram righteously declares he won't keep a single bootlace, because Abram doesn't want anyone to say that the king of Sodom made him rich. Is that kind of a backhanded compliment? I'm not sure. God came to Abram in a vision. God told Abram he was going to greatly reward him. Abram responds, "What good is the reward since I don't have any kids? My only heir is my stupid slave Eleazar of Damascus." But God said, "Eleazar isn't going to inherit any of your loot. Your son will get it." "Sorry, Eleazar." God says, "No loot for you." Next, God tells Abram to count the stars. God said Abram's descendants would be this many. Then God told Abram again how much land he was going to give him that already had people living on it. Who cares about that? Abram asked, "How do I know this land will be mine?" And God should have said, "Because I said so. I'm God. Don't ask stupid questions." But instead, God gives Abram a grocery list for some reason. He tells Abram to get him a cow, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a pigeon. So Abram got everything on the shopping list and then cut it all in half. Ew. Except the birds. A little bit later, some vultures came to get all Abram's chopped up meat. so he had to shoo him away. Then Abram fell asleep and was filled with fear and terror. Maybe he had a nightmare. In this nightmare, God tells Abram a whole bunch of stuff about Abram's descendants and how he's going to make them slaves and treat them cruelly for a little while, but only so he can punish the people who are enslaving them. Also, Abram's descendants get to eventually pillage all their slave masters' loot, which makes it okay in the end, I guess. Then a floating fire pot and a floating flaming torch appear and pass between the slabs of dead meat, I suppose setting it all on fire. Good News Bible doesn't say. Next, God tells Abram again all the land that he's going to give him, but this time specifies all the land between Egypt and the Euphrates River, where a bunch of people already currently live, like I keep saying. This is one of those chapters that I never went over in Sunday school. I wonder why. Now Sarai couldn't bear Abram any children because she was barren, because it's always the woman's fault in the Bible. So Sarai told Abram, "Here, sleep with and go in unto my slave Hagar, and any kids Hagar has will be my kids, because I said so, and we don't have DNA tests yet that say otherwise." So Abram took Hagar to wife, which means what exactly? Was there an actual wedding, or did Abram just have sexy time with her? Was take to wife a euphemism? I don't know. This brings me to a point I would like to talk about, which is biblical slavery. I've gone to a lot of Christian sites and YouTube videos which go into great lengths to explain that biblical slavery was totally different. I mentioned in a previous video that I was reading a book called Noah's Curse, the biblical justification of American slavery, and I'm about a third of the way through it. When I finish, I'll let you know what I think. I would also like to bring up that passage in Genesis 12 where Abram's slaves were listed amongst the cattle and the sheep and the donkeys and the flocks and the herds, which gives us a clue as to the perceived value of a slave. This brings us back to Hagar. Was this taking to wife stuff consensual? Did Hagar have any say whatsoever, or did she just submit to whatever Sarai and Abram told her to do? The Bible gives us no specific answers to these questions. I don't know, try not to think about it. Anyway, once Hagar became pregnant, things changed between Sarai and Hagar. Let's just say there was some tension. Sarai blames Abram for her new problems, and Sarai starts treating Hagar cruelly. Abram's all like, "Hey, barren sister wife, you told me to get some sexy time with your hot slave and put a bun in her oven. Don't blame me for your problems now. She's your servant. She meant nothing to me." At this point, I can just see Abram going to the bar and complaining to his buddies about his woman problems.
Women. You can't live with them, pass the beer nuts.
So Hagar had about enough of being treated cruelly. She decided to run away. But an angel of the Lord caught up with her while she was wandering in the desert. The angel told her to go back to her mistress and submit. Seriously, any Christian who tells you God doesn't promote slavery in the Bible, you read them this verse. The angel told Hagar to go back to a cruel mistress and submit. Next, the angel tells Hagar that she will have a son named Ishmael, who goes off to sail on a boat called the Pequod under Captain Ahab and hunt a giant white whale. Whoops, I got my books of fiction mixed up for a second there. Sorry about that. Okay, Hagar's son Ishmael. Ishmael will become a wild donkey of a man. Essentially, he won't have very many friends. Then Hagar declares that she has seen God. Hold on a second. I thought she saw an angel, because I heard that in future verses, no human can see God and live. I'm confused. Anyway, Hagar bore Abram's son Ishmael when Abram was 86 years old. So I guess the old guy wasn't firing blanks after all. So it must really have been Sarah's fault. She was barren, just like all biblical women are. Pfft, useless. God talks to Abram again and tells him to obey, be blameless, and perfect, which I guess means no more mistreatment and or sexy time with the help. Right, God? Right? God? God doesn't get too specific. Anyway, 99-year-old Abram falls on his face. I hope he had one of those first alert wrist necklace thingies. It's Abram, I've fallen, and I can't get up. Next, God has one of those spells where he repeats himself again and says, I promise you will be the ancestor of many nations. Your name will no longer be Abram, but Abraham, because I am making you the ancestor of many nations. By the way, in case you were wondering, the footnotes in my Bible tell me that Abram means the ancestor of many nations, so that's triply helpful. Then God goes on to say Abraham's ancestors will become nations just to drive the point home one more time. Maybe Abraham's hearing aids weren't working. What? Speak up, God! My name's Abram, not Abraham. Next, God, yet again, promises Abraham all the land that currently belongs to the Canaanites, but like we've been saying, forget Canaan and all his descendants because Ham saw his dad Noah drunk and naked. And Canaan camped somewhere he wasn't supposed to, so that's not his land to begin with. So omnibenevolent God never forgets a slight like that and makes sure all your descendants suffer Old Testament style for it forever. Then, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omnipresent God commands Abraham, that all of his chosen people need to be circumcised because God thinks something he created you with in a really sensitive area is totally gross. That includes babies, slaves, and foreigners living amongst you. So Abraham sharpens his knife and gets ready to start cutting. Now, circumcision is a hot button topic in modern times. There's a litany of websites talking about the pros and cons. The only real point that I want to make here is that Abraham might not have had the best or most sanitary medical means to make this procedure as painless and infection-free as possible. Did he use any anesthetic? The Bible doesn't say. Best not to dwell on it. Moving on, God also changes Sarai's name to Sarah. The footnotes of my Bible say Sarah means princess. Also, God tells 99-year-old Abraham to get to the baby making with his old crone sister wife and princess. Abraham, who had just put fresh batteries in his hearing aids, responds, What? My sister wife is way too old. She can't pop out any kids no more. She's all shriveled up down there. It's gross. Besides, I could barely stand to be in the same room with her. God tells Abraham to just shut up already and have sexy time with his late 80-something sister wife, because he's going to have a son named Isaac, which the footnotes tell me means he laughs. Well, he's not alone. So are we. Then God tells Abraham that his son Ishmael will be the father of great nations too. So all those foreskins must be worth a lot to God for some reason. Is there some foreskin stock we don't know about? Anyway, Abraham sharpens his favorite knife and gets to clipping foreskins, starting with his own and his son Ishmael's. Hope his eyesight was still good. The dude is 99 years old after all. And he keeps cutting off all the foreskins of all the men whose penises he could literally get his hands on until all the penises in camp were nice and clipped. You suppose Abraham waited a while to heal up before he went off and had sexy time to try to knock up his old wrinkly sister wife Sarah? Let's hope so. Well, this was a particularly gross chapter. Don't blame me, blame the Bible. I just work here.